The alarm on my wrist buzzed so hard it felt like it was trying to climb off my skin. I sat up in the dark cabin of my ship and read the message twice before I believed it. Earth had been exiled. Not threatened. Not warned. Exiled. The Galactic Council had voted, and the vote was already final by the time anyone on our side saw it happen. I ran through the corridor in my sleep clothes, bare feet slapping against cold metal, and burst into the command deck where Admiral Grant Holloway stood staring at a screen that showed the council chamber 1,000 light-years away. His face had no color in it. "They did not even call us to speak," he said, without turning around. "They just decided." I looked at the screen. Rows of alien delegates sat in a circle of pale light, calm as furniture, while a single line of text scrolled beneath them. Earth and all its colonies were declared unfit for continued relations with the wider galaxy. Effective immediately, all trade routes, defense treaties, and diplomatic protections were revoked. Our ambassadors were escorted out of the chamber like they were being removed from a theater for causing a disturbance. I remember thinking, this cannot be real. This has to be some kind of test. But nothing about the silence that followed felt like a test. It felt like a door closing, and closing forever. Why? I asked, though I already suspected the answer would not satisfy me. Holloway finally turned. Because we grew too fast for their comfort. Because in 100 years, we went from arguing about borders on one small planet to building ships that can survive contact with things that should have destroyed us. They call it instability. I call it fear. I had heard the arguments before, in quieter rooms, in academic papers nobody outside our system ever bothered to read. Humanity had not followed the accepted path. Other species took thousands of years to move from one technological era to the next, guided the whole time by careful oversight from older civilizations. We skipped that guidance entirely. We fought 2 world wars, split the atom, and then, within a handful of generations, built starships. To the Council, that pattern did not look like progress. It looked like a threat they could not predict, and things they cannot predict are things they choose to remove. I watched delegates from a dozen worlds nod along with the ruling as if it were the most reasonable thing they had heard all year. Not one of them looked toward the empty chairs where our diplomats used to sit. "What happens now?" I asked. Holloway walked to the window that looked out over the dry, red dust of the colony world we were stationed on, one of a handful of small human settlements outside our home system. Now, every port in Council space closes to us. Every trade deal collapses. Our colonies get marked for reclamation, which is their polite way of saying they intend to take them if we do not leave first. I felt something cold settle into my chest, the kind of cold that does not come from fear, but from disbelief slowly turning into anger. So we're supposed to just go home and wait for them to come take everything we built. "That's what they expect," Holloway said. "They expect us to beg for reinstatement, to apologize for existing the way we do, to promise we'll slow down, behave, wait our turn like every other species did before us." I looked at him and understood, in that moment, that he was not planning to beg for anything. Within an hour, every screen on the station carried the same broadcast. Council representatives explained, in calm and practiced voices, that humanity's exile was not a punishment but a protective measure, meant to give the galaxy time to adjust to a species that had developed without proper supervision. They used words like unpredictable and dangerous and immature, words that stung more because they were delivered so gently, as if they were doing us a favor by casting us out. I thought about my brother, still working construction crews on one of the outer colonies, a place that existed only because of a fragile trade agreement with a neighboring system. I thought about the families on every human settlement, who now had no protection, no support, and no voice, in a galaxy that had just decided we did not deserve one. By the time the sun set over the colony that day, every human ship in Council space had already been ordered to leave or face seizure. Communication channels that once connected us to 100 other species went dark within hours. It was as if someone had reached out and simply erased humanity from the map. I stood on the observation deck that night with Holloway and a young pilot named Nadia Kelso, watching the stars through the reinforced glass. Nadia had grown up on that colony her whole life, had never even seen Earth except in old photographs her grandmother kept. "Are we really alone now?" she asked quietly. Holloway did not answer right away. He watched the stars for a long moment, then said something I would remember for the rest of my life. "We were never really with them," he said. "They tolerated us. There's a difference between being included and being permitted to exist in a corner they controlled. Now we get to decide what we do without needing their permission." I felt the weight of his words settle over the deck like a change in gravity. For the first time since the message came through, the fear in my chest started to shift into something else, something sharper and steadier. Word came in over the next few hours that Earth's leadership, every nation working as one government by that point, had accepted the exile without protest. No angry demands, no desperate pleas for reconsideration, just a short message acknowledging the ruling and requesting no further contact until further notice. I did not understand it at first. It looked like surrender. It was not surrender. It was the quietest, most controlled kind of preparation I had ever witnessed. Within a day, every human fleet in Council space received the same order: return home, not in defeat, but in formation, disciplined, as if executing a plan that had already been decided long before that verdict was read aloud. I sat in the cockpit of my transport as we broke away from the colony's defense grid, watching the alien listening station in the distance, the one that had monitored our communications for years under the excuse of cultural observation. It sat there quietly, blinking its lights as if nothing had changed, as if it still had every right to watch us. Nadia flew beside me, her voice steady over the comm. "Do you think they know what's coming?" I looked at the listening station one more time before it disappeared behind us. "No," I said. "I don't think they have any idea." As our ships turned toward home, I felt something settle deep in my chest, quiet and certain. The Council had expected silence to mean weakness. They had expected our retreat to look like fear. They were about to learn that silence, from humanity, has always meant something else entirely. The first month of exile felt like living inside a held breath. Every port that once welcomed human ships now turned us away without explanation, and every trade agreement collapsed overnight as if it had never existed. I remember standing in a crowded hangar back on Earth, watching returning crews unload supplies meant for colonies that could no longer be resupplied through normal channels, and feeling the full size of what had happened settle over everyone at once. We were not just cut off from trade. We were cut off from information, from allies, from the illusion that the galaxy had ever considered us equals. Every broadcast from Council space referred to humanity in the past tense, as if we were already a historical footnote rather than a living civilization still capable of response. I sat in on a private meeting of senior officers a week after our return, one of the smaller rooms beneath Earth's unified command center, where the air smelled like recycled metal and stronger coffee than usual. Admiral Holloway stood at the head of the table, along with two people I had not expected to see together in the same room: Colonel Lena Marsh from what used to be the Northern Defense Division, and a soft-spoken engineer named Owen Price, who had spent the last decade designing weapons systems that were never approved for full deployment because of Council restrictions on independent human military development. "For years they told us what we were allowed to build," Owen said, sliding a data slate across the table. "Every advanced propulsion system, every weapons platform, every defensive shield technology, all of it required review and approval from a Council oversight committee that never once approved anything that might make us equal to them. And now," Lena said, finishing his thought, "there is no committee left to ask." I looked around the table and understood, in that moment, that the exile the Council believed would cripple humanity had instead removed the only leash that had ever held us back. Over the following weeks, I watched shipyards across Earth and its remaining colonies shift into a rhythm I had never seen before. Workers who once operated in careful shifts under strict oversight now worked around the clock, 3 shifts overlapping into each other, driven by something that felt less like fear and more like purpose. I walked through one of the largest shipyards outside the old city of Bristol, watching massive hull frames rise from scaffolding that stretched higher than any structure the council had ever permitted us to build in open space. "We used to hide projects like this," Owen told me, standing beside me as sparks rained down from a welding platform above us. "Small pieces here, a prototype there, always disguised as civilian research so the council inspectors would not ask too many questions. Now we do not have to hide anything." I asked him what changed the most, expecting him to talk about the ships themselves. He surprised me. "The rules," he said. "For the first time we get to decide what humanity is capable of, instead of someone else deciding for us." I began traveling between colonies during that period, documenting the shift for command, and everywhere I went I saw the same transformation. Farmers who once grew crops for trade with alien markets now redirected everything towards self-sufficiency. Engineers who once designed civilian transport ships now retrained for military production. Even schools adjusted their programs, teaching young people survival skills and technical trades instead of the diplomatic studies that had once prepared them for careers working alongside other species. Nadia Kelso, the young pilot I had grown close to during our final days in council space, was reassigned to a training program designed to prepare pilots for combat scenarios far more advanced than anything we had trained for before. I visited her once during a routine assignment near the training facility, and found her standing beside a new fighter design unlike anything I had seen. "They built this in 6 weeks, she said, running her hand along the hull. 6 weeks, Elias. Something like this used to take years just to get approved for testing." I asked her if she was afraid, given how quickly everything had accelerated. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I used to be afraid of being alone in the galaxy," she said. "Now I think I am more afraid of what happens when we are ready, and they still refuse to see us as anything other than a mistake they made a long time ago." I understood what she meant. Every advancement made during those months carried a strange duality, pride in what we were building, mixed with an uncomfortable awareness of why we were building it. This was not growth for the sake of curiosity. This was growth born from being told we did not belong, and choosing, quietly and deliberately, to prove otherwise. 6 months into the exile, reports began arriving of council patrols moving closer to human territory under the excuse of monitoring compliance with the new restrictions. I remember the tension in the command room the day the first patrol crossed into what used to be recognized as neutral space near one of our smaller colonies. Holloway called an emergency session, and this time the room was filled beyond capacity, officers standing along every wall, engineers and analysts crowding in from adjoining departments. I stood near the back beside Lena, watching the main screen display the patrol's slow, deliberate movement toward colony space. "They are testing us," Lena said quietly, "seeing how close they can come before we react." "And if we do not react?" I asked. "Then they come closer next time," she said, "and the time after that, until reclamation becomes something they simply do, without warning." I watched Holloway study the screen for a long moment before speaking. His voice, when it came, held none of the fear that had gripped the room during the first announcement of exile. Instead, it held something calm, almost patient, like a man who had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. "We do not wait for reclamation to become official policy," he said. "We remind them why exile was supposed to protect them from us in the first place." The room went completely silent. Over the following weeks, our fleet quietly began repositioning near key locations along the border with council space, staying just far enough back to avoid triggering an immediate confrontation, but close enough to respond the moment any real threat presented itself. I remember the strange calm that settled over command during that period, a calm built not on confidence alone, but on the simple knowledge that we finally had the tools to answer confrontation on our own terms. The listening station I had seen months earlier, the one that had monitored human communications under the excuse of cultural observation, remained active throughout this period, feeding information back to Council Command about our movements. I sat in briefings where analysts confirmed the station had been quietly gathering data on human military development for over a decade, long before the exile was ever announced. They knew we were capable of more than they admitted, Owen said during one such briefing. That station has been watching us grow this entire time, feeding reports back to committees who used that information to justify restricting our development even further. I asked him what he thought should happen to it. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, calm, deliberate, entirely certain. I think it is time they understood that watching us is no longer something they get to do without consequence. 3 days later, under direct order from command, a small strike group moved toward the listening station under cover of a routine supply run near the border. I was assigned to monitor the operation from a secondary vessel positioned just outside sensor range, watching the entire event unfold across multiple data feeds. The station's defenses activated the moment our ships crossed into range, exactly as expected, but their response time revealed something important. They had grown complacent, confident that no human force would ever dare approach without permission. Our ships moved with a precision that surprised even the officers monitoring the operation, disabling the station's defensive systems within minutes and securing the facility with minimal resistance. I watched the confirmation come through on my screen, a simple line of text reporting the station successfully neutralized and its personnel safely evacuated to secure holding. No casualties, no prolonged conflict, just a clean, controlled statement that humanity was no longer willing to be observed without consent. The reaction across council networks came almost immediately. I watched reports flood in over the following hours, alien news channels struggling to explain how a species so recently dismissed as unpredictable and unstable had managed such a precise, disciplined operation without a single casualty on either side. Holloway gathered the senior staff again that night, and for the first time since the exile began, I saw something close to relief in his expression. They expected us to disappear quietly, he said. Instead, we just reminded them that we were listening the entire time they thought they held all the information. I looked around the room at faces that mixed exhaustion with something steadier, something that felt, for the first time in months, like hope rather than fear. Nadia found me later that night on the observation deck, the same place we had stood together the night the exile was announced. She stared out at the stars for a long time before speaking. "Do you think this is the beginning of something bigger?" she asked. I thought about the shipyards working around the clock, the training programs accelerating faster than anyone had predicted, the quiet confidence that had replaced the fear I saw on every face during those first difficult days. "I think," I said, "this is only the beginning of them understanding what they actually exiled." She smiled, faintly, and turned back toward the stars. Neither of us spoke again that night, but I remember feeling, for the first time since the verdict was read aloud in that cold council chamber, that the silence surrounding us no longer felt like defeat. It felt like preparation for something the galaxy was not ready to face. The call came through at 3 in the morning, and I knew before I even reached the command deck that whatever waited for us on the other end of that signal would change everything again. Holloway stood at the center of the room, surrounded by officers whose faces looked tighter than I had ever seen them. "A council fleet has entered the outer edge of colonial space," he said, without waiting for anyone to ask. 12 ships, not a patrol, a response. I felt my stomach drop. After the listening station, we had expected some reaction, but nothing this immediate, nothing this large. "They are moving toward Halden Colony," Lena said, pulling up a display that showed the fleet's projected path. "If they reach it before we intercept, they will use it as justification to escalate reclamation across every remaining human settlement." I thought of Halden immediately, a small farming colony with barely enough defense capability to protect against raiders, let alone a council battle fleet. My brother lived there. I had visited only months earlier, walked through fields that stretched toward a horizon lit gold by 2 suns, laughed with him over dinner, while his children argued about whose turn it was to feed the animals. "How long until they arrive?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. 18 hours, Owen answered from across the room. "We can intercept before they reach the colony, but only if we move immediately." Holloway looked around the room, and for the first time since the exile began, I saw the full weight of command settle onto his shoulders. This would not be a quiet operation like the listening station. This would be the first real confrontation between human forces and a council fleet, in the open, with no room to hide the outcome from the rest of the galaxy. "Assemble the fleet," he said. "We move within the hour." I was assigned to a support vessel trailing just behind the main strike formation, tasked with coordinating communications between ships during the engagement. Nadia flew one of the lead fighters, part of a squadron built entirely from designs finalized only weeks earlier, technology so new that some of the pilots had barely completed more than a handful of training runs before deployment. The journey toward Halden Colony felt longer than any I had experienced, every hour stretching under the weight of what waited at the end of it. I spent much of that time reviewing tactical data with Owen, studying the Council Fleet's ship classes, searching for weaknesses in designs that had gone unchanged for centuries because no species had ever forced them to adapt. "Their ships are built for intimidation," Owen explained, pointing to structural diagrams on his display. "Massive profiles, heavy forward shielding, powerful weapons built to end confrontations quickly against species who never dared challenge them directly." "And our ships?" I asked. He allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Ours are built to survive being underestimated." When we arrived at the edge of Halden's system, the Council fleet was already visible on long-range sensors, 12 ships moving in a slow, deliberate formation that radiated confidence rather than caution. I watched Holloway issue the final order from the command vessel, his voice steady despite the tension gripping every officer around him. "Fold space maneuver in 10 minutes, he said. "We do not give them time to adjust to a battlefield they do not expect." I had heard whispers about the fold space tactic during earlier briefings, a maneuver developed specifically during the months following our exile, allowing our smaller ships to emerge from short-range folds directly around enemy formations rather than approaching through open space where they would be detected far earlier. It was risky, unstable, and something no Council fleet had ever encountered from a species they considered technologically inferior. The moment arrived faster than I expected. I watched through secondary sensors as our fleet vanished from open space and reappeared moments later scattered around the Council formation, ships emerging from every angle at once, catching the enemy fleet completely off guard. The battle that followed remains, even now, the most intense experience of my life. I watched Council ships scramble to adjust their massive, centuries-old defensive protocols against an attack pattern their systems had never been designed to anticipate. Our smaller, faster ships moved through gaps in their formation that should not have existed, striking weak points along engine housings and shield generators before retreating into fold space maneuvers that made pursuit nearly impossible. Nadia's voice came through the comm during the height of the engagement, tense but controlled. 2 enemy ships disabled, moving to secondary target. I watched her squadron execute maneuvers that should have taken years of additional training to master, weaving between defensive fire with a precision that spoke to just how far our capabilities had advanced during those months of preparation. The Council fleet, for all its size and reputation, struggled visibly against tactics built on speed and unpredictability rather than raw power. I watched one of their largest ships attempt a slow, deliberate turn to bring its main weapons systems to bear, only to be struck along its unshielded rear section by 3 of our fighters coordinating an attack pattern that had been designed specifically to exploit that exact weakness. But the battle was not without cost. I heard the report come through nearly 40 minutes into the engagement, a voice I recognized immediately, tight with grief despite the discipline required to deliver it. "We lost Owen's ship," the voice said. "Direct hit during the second wave. No survivors." I sat frozen for a moment. the weight of the words settling over me like something physical. Owen, who had designed half the technology responsible for our success that day, who had spoken with such quiet certainty about what humanity was finally capable of, was gone. I did not have time to process the loss fully in that moment. The battle continued around us, and grief would have to wait until the engagement ended. I forced myself to focus on the tactical display, coordinating communications between ships as the Council fleet, battered and disoriented, began a slow retreat toward the edge of the system. By the time the engagement ended, 7 of the 12 Council ships had been disabled or destroyed, and the remaining 5 retreated in a formation that looked nothing like the confident approach they had displayed only hours earlier. Halden Colony remained untouched, its fields and families safe, unaware of how close they had come to becoming another casualty of reclamation. I stood on the observation deck of the command vessel that night, staring out at the stars, the same way I had during those first uncertain days of exile. Nadia joined me eventually, her flight suit still marked with the strain of the battle, her expression carrying a mixture of relief and grief that mirrored my own. "We won," she said quietly, though her voice held none of the triumph I might have expected. "We did," I said, "but we lost people to get there." She nodded, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, simply standing together in the silence that followed a victory too costly to celebrate freely. Word of the battle spread faster than anyone expected. Within days, footage captured from various ships during the engagement had spread across networks throughout Council space, shared not by human channels, but by observers from other species who had witnessed the confrontation from nearby systems. I watched the reports come through with a strange mixture of pride and unease, seeing our fleet's tactics analyzed and discussed across a dozen different alien networks, each one grappling with the same unsettling realization. Humanity had not simply survived exile. We had fought back, decisively, against a fleet the Council had sent expecting an easy demonstration of authority. I remember watching one particular broadcast from a neutral observation station near the border, a calm, measured voice from a species I did not recognize, discussing the implications of what had happened at Halden. "For the first time in recorded memory," the voice said, "a species deemed unfit for inclusion has demonstrated capability equal to, or perhaps exceeding, forces maintained by the Council itself. This raises questions that many member worlds may find uncomfortable to answer." I sat with those words for a long time afterward, thinking about Owen, about the quiet certainty in his voice, when he spoke of humanity finally being allowed to decide its own capabilities. He had not lived to see the result of his work fully realized, but the result spoke for itself across every corner of the galaxy that had once considered us beneath consideration. The Council's regional fleet retreated fully within the week, abandoning any further attempt at reclamation near Halden or any of the other outer colonies. I received reports of increased defensive posturing throughout remaining Council territories, a sign, Holloway explained, that our victory had done more than simply protect one small farming colony. It had forced an entire galaxy to reconsider everything they believed about the species they had tried so quickly to erase. I attended Owen's memorial 3 days after the battle ended, standing among engineers and officers who had worked alongside him during those months of rapid development. Someone spoke about his contributions, about the designs that had made our victory possible, about a mind that had spent years working in the shadows because the Council refused to allow him the freedom to build what he knew humanity was capable of. I thought about how strange it was that his greatest achievement came only after the very restrictions that had held him back for so long were finally removed. Standing there, listening to the quiet grief around me, I understood something I had not fully grasped until that moment. Victory, even necessary victory, always carries weight. We had proven something vital to a galaxy that doubted us, but the cost of that proof would stay with us far longer than the celebration that followed it. I looked toward the sky that evening, toward stars that no longer felt as distant or unreachable as they once had, and made a quiet promise to myself, one I suspected every person standing beside me shared in their own way. Whatever came next, we would meet it having already proven exactly what we were capable of, and we would carry every loss along that road as a reminder of exactly why we could never afford to be underestimated again. 3 weeks after Halden, a ship arrived at the edge of our system that none of our sensors recognized, broadcasting a request for peaceful contact in a language our translation systems struggled to fully process. I stood in the command room as Holloway ordered a cautious response, and within hours we learned that the ship carried representatives from a species called the Verith, a smaller civilization that had spent decades under heavy trade restrictions imposed by the same council that had exiled us. Their lead representative, a quiet, careful being named Sorrel, sat across from Holloway during the first formal meeting I was permitted to observe. Sorrel spoke slowly, choosing each word with obvious caution. "We watched what happened at Halden," Sorrel said. "We have wanted to speak against the council for a long time, but we lacked the strength to do so alone. Your victory suggested, for the first time, that strength might not remain entirely on their side." Holloway listened carefully before responding. "What exactly are you proposing?" "An alliance," Sorrel said. "Nothing formal yet. A quiet exchange of information, resources, support. We have access to certain trade routes still open to us, routes that could help ease the isolation your species currently faces." I watched Holloway consider the offer for a long moment. I understood, even without him saying it aloud, that accepting help from another marginalized species carried risk. It could easily be seen as further evidence of instability, further proof to the Council that humanity was building alliances meant to threaten their authority. But refusing help, when the alternative was continued isolation, carried its own risk. "We accept," Holloway said finally, "carefully, and on our own terms." Over the following weeks, similar approaches came from other quarters of the galaxy, some offering genuine partnership, others clearly hoping to use humanity's newfound reputation for their own advantage. I attended several of these meetings, watching Holloway and the rest of command carefully separate opportunity from exploitation. One meeting in particular stayed with me longer than the others. A representative from a larger, more established species arrived requesting access to our new tactical designs, offering trade concessions in exchange for military technology developed during our months of preparation. I watched Holloway calmly decline the offer, explaining that our technology, hard-won through loss and necessity, would not become a commodity traded away simply because someone now recognized its value. "They want what cost us everything to build," Lena said afterward, standing beside me as the representative's ship departed. "And they expect us to hand it over simply because we finally proved we could use it." I nodded, thinking of Owen, of the quiet certainty in his voice when he spoke about finally being trusted to build what humanity needed most. "They will learn," I said, "that respect earned through loss is not something easily purchased." Meanwhile, reports from within Council space suggested growing division among member worlds regarding how to respond to humanity's continued resistance. I sat through numerous briefings where analysts explained the shifting political landscape, describing factions forming among species who had grown tired of the Council's rigid control over technological development, and others who feared what might happen if humanity's example inspired further resistance throughout the galaxy. I remember one particular intelligence report describing a heated session within the Council chamber itself, where representatives argued openly about whether continued aggression toward humanity would strengthen or further destabilize their authority. Some delegates pushed for immediate, overwhelming military response, determined to make an example of us before other species grew emboldened by our success. Others urged caution, warning that further escalation might only accelerate the very outcome they feared most, a galaxy where smaller, restricted species began questioning Council authority altogether. I found myself, during this period, assigned to a small operation near the border of Council space involving the capture of a communications officer whose ship had strayed too close to human patrol routes while attempting to gather intelligence. I was present during the initial interrogation, curious to understand how someone from within Council command viewed the situation unfolding around them. The officer, a composed, almost arrogant being named Threll, sat across from me in a secure holding room, clearly expecting the kind of treatment the Council had always assumed lesser species would resort to when given power over a captured enemy. "You will not gain anything through this," Threll said, before I had even asked a question. "Whatever information you believe I hold will not save your species from what is coming." I studied him for a long moment before responding, remembering every condescending broadcast the Council had issued since the day of our exile, every calm, dismissive explanation for why humanity deserved to be cast aside. "I am not here to threaten you," I said calmly. "I am simply here to understand you, the way your Council once claimed to be studying us, before deciding we were unfit to exist alongside the rest of the galaxy." Threll's composure faltered slightly at that. "You speak as though we are equals," he said. "We are," I said, "whether your Council chooses to admit it or not." I asked him a series of careful questions, not about military secrets, but about how the Council viewed humanity now, after Halden, after the growing unrest among smaller species emboldened by our resistance. Threll answered cautiously at first. Then, as the conversation continued, with something closer to genuine reflection. "There is fear," he admitted eventually, "not just of your capabilities, but of what your example represents. Many species have lived under restrictions similar to those imposed on you, restrictions justified by claims of protection and guidance. Your resistance has shown them that such restrictions were never truly about protection at all." I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, understanding that the true impact of our resistance extended far beyond military victories. We were not simply proving humanity's strength. We were exposing a system built on control disguised as guidance, a system many species had quietly resented for generations without daring to challenge it directly. Word came several weeks later that internal divisions within the Council had grown severe enough to delay any further coordinated action against humanity. Instead, individual member worlds began reaching out independently, some hoping to negotiate quiet trade agreements outside official Council channels, others simply curious to understand a species that had refused to disappear quietly. I remember standing beside Holloway during a private briefing where he outlined our next move, a decision that would determine whether our resistance remained purely defensive or whether we would take the next step toward forcing genuine change. "We push toward their outer administrative worlds," he said, pointing toward a section of the galactic map that represented smaller Council territories responsible for enforcing trade restrictions and monitoring exiled or marginalized species. Not to conquer, not to destroy, but to demonstrate clearly and undeniably that the old system of control can no longer function without our voice included in it. I felt a mixture of excitement and unease at the plan. This would not be a simple defensive engagement like Halden. This would be a deliberate push into territory the Council had always considered entirely their own. "What happens if they see this as an act of full aggression?" I asked. Holloway considered the question carefully before answering. "Then they will finally understand that continued exclusion carries a cost they are no longer prepared to pay." Over the following days, our fleet prepared for what would become the most significant operation since Halden, coordinating with several of the smaller allied species who had reached out in recent weeks, including Sorrel's people, who offered valuable intelligence regarding the layout and defenses of the administrative worlds we intended to approach. Nadia and I spoke the night before departure, standing once again on the same observation deck where so many important conversations between us had taken place since the exile began. "Do you think this will finally force them to negotiate?" she asked. I thought carefully before answering. "I think," I said, "they no longer have the luxury of choosing whether or not to negotiate. The only question now is how much more they lose before they accept that." She nodded, staring out at the stars with an expression that mixed determination with quiet exhaustion. "I keep thinking about Owen," she said softly, "about how much he wanted to see humanity finally treated as an equal, rather than something to be observed and restricted." "I think about him too," I admitted. "Every time we make progress, I wonder if this is the moment he would have wanted to see most." We stood together in silence for a while longer before returning to our separate preparations for the operation ahead. I felt the weight of everything that had happened since the exile pressing down on me that night. The loss, the uncertainty, the strange, fragile hope that had grown steadily throughout months of resistance. The following morning, our fleet departed toward Council administrative space, carrying with it not just weapons and tactical plans, but the accumulated resolve of an entire species that had refused to accept the fate handed to them by a galaxy that once believed it held all the power to decide who deserved to exist among the stars. I watched Earth grow smaller behind us as we entered the folds of space that would carry us toward our next confrontation, thinking about everything that had led us to this moment, the verdict that had once felt like an ending, the quiet preparation that followed, the costly victory at Halden, and now, finally, the decision to stop simply defending what remained and instead force the galaxy to acknowledge what humanity had truly become. I did not know, as our ships moved deeper into unfamiliar space, exactly what waited for us at the administrative worlds ahead, but I understood, with a certainty I had not felt since the earliest days of exile, that whatever happened next would determine not just humanity's future among the stars, but the future of every smaller species who had watched us, quietly, hoping we might prove strong enough to change the rules that had governed the galaxy for far longer than any of us had been alive to witness. The administrative world called Threndus appeared on our sensors after 3 days of travel, a pale ringed planet surrounded by a dense network of orbital stations responsible for coordinating trade restrictions across an entire sector of Council space. I stood on the bridge beside Holloway as our fleet approached, watching the stations light up with defensive activity the moment our presence registered on their sensors. "They were not expecting us here," Lena said, studying the scattered, disorganized response forming around the planet. "This far into administrative space, they never imagined we would come." I felt a strange calm settle over me as I watched the stations scramble to coordinate a response. After everything that had happened since the exile, after Halden, after the loss of Owen, after months of preparation and quiet resolve, we had finally arrived at the heart of the system that had decided humanity did not deserve a place among the stars. Holloway gave the order calmly, without hesitation: "Move into position. Disable their communication relays first. We are not here to destroy this world. We are here to make sure they cannot ignore us any longer." Our fleet moved with practiced precision, targeting communication arrays and defensive platforms while carefully avoiding civilian sections of the orbital stations. I watched the operation unfold across multiple data feeds, our ships weaving between defensive fire with the same discipline that had carried us through Halden months earlier. Within 2 hours, the administrative stations surrounding Threndus had lost the ability to coordinate any meaningful defense, their communication relays disabled, their orbital defenses neutralized without a single station suffering catastrophic damage. I remember the strange quiet that settled over the command deck as the operation concluded, a silence that felt entirely different from the exhausted relief following Halden. This silence felt like control. Holloway opened a direct channel to the largest administrative station, broadcasting a message that would soon spread throughout every corner of Council space, still capable of receiving transmissions. "We are not here for conquest," he said, his voice steady and clear. "We are here because a decision was made, without our voice, that humanity did not belong among the civilizations of this galaxy. We have spent months proving that decision was based on fear rather than fact. Today we ask, clearly and without further patience, for the Council to reconvene and address that decision directly." The response came slower than I expected, nearly 6 hours passing before any formal acknowledgement arrived from Council leadership. When it finally came, it carried none of the confident, dismissive tone that had characterized every previous communication since our exile began. The Council agreed to a formal session, to be held within the week, specifically addressing humanity's status and the events that had unfolded since our exile was first announced. I felt the weight of that moment settle over the entire fleet as the news spread. Months of preparation, loss, and quiet resolve had finally forced the very institution that tried to erase us back to a table we had once been removed from entirely. The journey toward the Council's central chamber felt different from every previous confrontation. This was not a battle, this was a negotiation, one we approached from a position of strength rather than desperation. I stood among the delegation Holloway assembled for the session, alongside Lena, Nadia, and several representatives from allied species, including Sorrel, who had insisted on accompanying us as a show of solidarity from those who had suffered under similar restrictions for far longer than humanity ever had. The chamber itself looked exactly as it had during the broadcast announcing our exile months earlier, rows of delegates seated in careful, deliberate arrangement, though the atmosphere within the room felt entirely transformed. Where once they had regarded humanity with dismissive confidence, I now saw careful, measured caution in nearly every expression around the chamber. Holloway stood at the center of the room, and I watched him take a slow breath before speaking, choosing his words with the same discipline that had carried our species through everything since that first devastating verdict. "Months ago," he began, "this council decided humanity was unfit to remain among the recognized civilizations of this galaxy. That decision was made without discussion, without genuine consideration of what we had built, and without any true understanding of what we were capable of, should we be forced to act alone." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle across the chamber before continuing. "We do not stand here today asking for forgiveness, or for reinstatement into a system that never truly valued our presence. We stand here to establish new terms that reflect what humanity has proven itself capable of, and terms that we expect this council to respect moving forward." A murmur passed through the delegates, quiet but unmistakable. I watched several representatives exchange uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for the confidence carried in Holloway's voice. One senior delegate, an older being whose voice carried the weight of long-standing authority within the council, rose slowly to respond. "You speak as though victory in a handful of engagements grants you authority equal to institutions that have governed this galaxy for thousands of years," he said, though his tone lacked the confident dismissal I remembered from earlier broadcasts. Holloway did not waver. "We speak from the position of a species that refused to disappear simply because an institution decided we should. Every world you have restricted, every species you have controlled through fear of exclusion, watched what happened when one species finally refused to accept those terms. That alone should tell you everything you need to understand about what continued resistance to change might cost you." I watched the chamber fall into a heavy, uncertain silence following his words. For the first time since the exile began, I saw genuine uncertainty ripple through delegates who had once treated humanity's fate as a foregone conclusion. The negotiations that followed stretched across several long days, each session testing the resolve of everyone present. I sat through discussions where humanity demanded full restoration of trade rights, formal recognition as an independent, self-governing civilization no longer subject to council oversight, and guaranteed protection for every remaining human colony throughout the galaxy. More than that, our delegation insisted on formal acknowledgement that species deemed unfit for inclusion under the Council's previous standards deserved the right to develop independently, free from restrictions imposed without their consent. Sorrel spoke passionately during several of these sessions, representing not just their own people, but countless smaller species who had lived for generations under similar restrictions, hoping that humanity's resistance might finally open a path toward greater independence for everyone affected by the Council's rigid control. I watched the delegates argue amongst themselves throughout these sessions, factions forming and dissolving as different worlds weighed the risks of continued resistance against the clear demonstration of strength humanity had shown throughout the preceding months. Some delegates remained resistant until the very end, unwilling to accept that the system they had built and maintained for so long could no longer function exactly as it once had. But by the final day of negotiations, the balance had shifted decisively. The Council agreed to humanity's terms, formally recognizing Earth and its colonies as an independent civilization, free from further oversight, with full trade rights restored, and guaranteed protections established for every human settlement throughout the galaxy. I stood beside Holloway as the final agreement was signed, watching delegates who had once dismissed us with casual confidence now regard our delegation with a mixture of respect and lingering unease. It was not the triumphant celebration I might have imagined during the earliest, most uncertain days of exile. It felt instead like the quiet, hard-earned conclusion of something that had cost far more than any of us anticipated when this journey began. Afterward, I walked alongside Nadia through the corridors of the chamber, both of us silent for a long time before she finally spoke. "We did it," she said softly. "We actually did it." I thought about Owen, about the quiet certainty in his voice when he spoke of humanity finally deciding its own future, about how much he had sacrificed to make this moment possible. I thought about every family on every colony who had lived through months of uncertainty, waiting to see whether humanity would survive the galaxy's rejection or simply fade away as the Council had expected. "We did," I said finally, "though I don't think any of us imagined it would look quite like this." She smiled, faintly, understanding exactly what I meant. In the weeks that followed, humanity's new status spread throughout the galaxy, inspiring cautious hope among numerous smaller species who had spent generations living under similar restrictions. Sorel's people began formal negotiations of their own, using the precedent humanity had established to demand greater independence from Council oversight. Other species, emboldened by what they had witnessed, began quietly organizing similar efforts throughout different sectors of Council space. I returned to Earth several weeks after the final negotiations concluded, standing once again in orbit, looking down at the planet that had once felt like the center of an entire civilization, suddenly cast adrift by forces far beyond its control. The fields near Halden Colony had recovered fully from the tension of that difficult period, my brother's family safe, their lives continuing much as they had before, though the galaxy around them had changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. I thought often, during those quiet weeks following our return, about everything we had lost along the way, about Owen, about countless others who had given everything to ensure humanity's survival during those uncertain months. Victory, I had come to understand, never erased the cost required to achieve it. It simply gave meaning to sacrifices that might otherwise have been forgotten. Standing on the observation deck one final evening, looking out at Earth from orbit, I found myself reflecting on the entire journey that had led us to this moment. The Council had exiled us believing we would fade quietly into insignificance. Another cautionary tale whispered among species too afraid to challenge the system that governed their lives. Instead, we had proven something far more significant. We had shown an entire galaxy that strength did not require permission, that resilience could not be dictated by institutions built on fear disguised as protection, and that a species determined to survive would always find a way to make its presence undeniable, regardless of how thoroughly others attempted to erase it. I thought about the quiet promise I had made to myself after Owen's memorial, the promise that whatever came next, we would carry every loss along the way as a reminder of exactly why we could never afford to be underestimated again. Standing there, watching Earth turn slowly beneath me, bathed in the same light that had once seemed so distant and unreachable during those first difficult days of exile, I understood that promise had finally been fulfilled. They had tried to exile us into silence. Instead, we became a voice the entire galaxy would remember, for as long as the stars themselves continued to burn.